Hans regained consciousness at the edge of the forest, lying on the damp ground among low shrubs. He felt a throbbing pain in the back of his head and couldn't immediately understand why his body was covered in scratches and abrasions. Only fragments of memory resurfaced. A bright flash of headlights, a dull thud, a metallic clang. He lay still, listening to the rustling of leaves. When the pain eased a bit, he stood up, struggling to keep his balance. His knees buckled, but he noticed he was wearing combat gear, and a rifle lay beside him. He was startled by this strange find, as though someone had deliberately left a weapon and equipment for him. The sun was low, its light casting soft rays along the forest's edge. Hans expected to see the wreck of his own vehicle nearby, but found not a single piece of metal. There was no blood on the road, no trace of an accident. He felt around his head, searching for a wound, but discovered only a dried scab on his forehead. Trying to make sense of what had happened, he looked along the line of trees and saw the faint silhouettes of buildings, roughly 300 yards away. He moved toward them slowly, slinging the rifle over his shoulder. He didn't want to take unnecessary risks, but staying in the woods seemed pointless. His throbbing head made it hard to think clearly. Hans stopped several times, listening to his own breathing. After about 200 yards, he noticed for the first time how neglected the road to the town looked. The old asphalt was cracked and overgrown with weeds. Occasionally, he came across rusted road signs with no legible words. One had a half-erased inscription he couldn't make out. As he drew closer, he saw a crooked sign covered with rust spots, where someone had crudely crossed out the town's name. He paused, expecting to hear voices or cars, but was met with oppressive silence. Only a light wind stirred dust at the base of street lamps that hadn't worked in a long time. It seemed no one lived here anymore, and hadn't for many years. He walked a few more yards along the littered shoulder and entered what had likely once been a bustling town. Now it was surrounded by half-collapsed houses with shattered windows. Empty doorways showed signs of forced entry. On the walls were messages carved with something sharp. "Beware. It hunts at night. Don't trust what you see." These warnings did nothing to calm him. Hans felt a surge of anxiety within. He continued along the main street, careful not to make noise. Old newspapers lay discarded at the sides, bearing faded headlines and black-and-white photographs. Torn plastic bags rustled in the wind with an unsettling sound. It looked as if the town had been abandoned in a hurry. At an intersection, he spotted several deserted vehicles, 2 cars and a truck. The truck's battered cab appeared to have been pried open, but inside was only a shredded seat and dangling wires from the dashboard. Inspecting the truck, Hans realized it had been without fuel for a long time. He checked the tanks of the other cars. They were also empty. Just as he finished, he noticed the day was quickly coming to an end. The sun dipped toward the horizon, its crimson light washing over the rooftops of the ramshackle buildings. No streetlights came on in the town. Hans imagined how risky it would become when darkness fully settled. He didn't know who or what might be wandering around this deserted place. He remembered he had no water or food. Searching his pockets, he found neither a canteen nor any rations, just a few magazines for the rifle and a small flashlight. Hans still couldn't fathom why he had survived an accident that seemed to have vanished without a trace. Exhaustion weighed on him, but stopping in the middle of the street would have been foolish. he scanned the area, hoping to find at least one building to shelter in for a while. Off to the right stood an old gas station. A faded sign swung on squeaky metal brackets. Hans walked over to inspect it. The inside was in disarray. Empty shelves, shattered glass, encrusted stains on the floor. The fuel pumps had no caps, their tanks drained. It was clear he wouldn't be finding a working vehicle here anytime soon. A sense of helplessness grew. Stepping outside, he looked over the street. It was getting darker, and he still had no idea where he could spend the night. The town was sinking into dusk, and each empty corner felt like a threat. Hans felt aches all over his body and realized he needed to rest. He noticed a half-collapsed annex beside the gas station. There was no door, and inside were scattered chairs and empty bottles. Hans stepped in to catch his breath. The day was winding down. The air was becoming damp. In the distance, there was a faint rustling, as if something was sliding across the asphalt. Hans froze in place, but he saw no shapes in the dim light. He understood he needed to find a more secure place. Night could bring sudden dangers, and staying out in the open would make him an easy target. He got back on his feet and moved on slowly. He hadn't eaten or drunk anything all day, and his headache grew worse. No one knew how long he'd been unconscious, but he felt completely drained. A rising sense of dread took hold of him. Without food, or most crucially water, he wouldn't last long. He ran his hand over the back of his head, recalling the blow he'd taken in the accident, and wondered if his injuries might be more serious than they seemed. Once night fell, the town was swallowed by total darkness. Not a single light glowed. No billboards were illuminated. No windows shone. It felt as though no one had lived there for ages. Hans stopped by a rundown cafe, gasping for breath. Inside, everything was trashed, and he couldn't find so much as a scrap of food. Empty shelves, wires ripped out of the walls, shattered windows, all signs that people had abandoned this place long ago. Stepping back outside, he looked around. The wind was picking up. Somewhere, twisted metal squealed as it rubbed against itself. The night air seeped into his bones. He realized he needed shelter, or at least some way to get water. He was tormented by thirst. His lips cracked, and he knew he might collapse if he didn't find a way to survive. Right then, he spotted a faint glow in the distance, like a tiny beacon of light, maybe from a lamp or flashlight. In this dead city, any light was a miracle, and Hans felt a surge of hope. He decided that light might mean water or even people who could help. Picking his way around heaps of trash and broken glass, he headed toward that faint glimmer. After covering about 300 yards, he reached the edge of a block and saw a faded sign for a roadside store. Sure enough, weak electric light shone from behind the windows. Hans held his breath and studied the scene. He heard no steps or voices, but this was the kind of place that could hide anything, from wild animals to people as heavily armed as he was. A lone grocery store, still lit amid the darkness, looked suspicious, like a trap waiting to be sprung. He crept closer, keeping to the walls. Before going in, he cautiously peeked through a window. The illumination came from several small ceiling lamps. The shelves weren't entirely empty. On a middle rack sat a few bottles of water. Just seeing them made his heart pound. He was willing to take a gamble to get his hands on some. Right then, a movement caught his eye. A shadow flitted down the alley to the right. He ducked, watching. Soon he saw the silhouette of a man carrying a sniper rifle. The man moved noiselessly like a hunter, and Hans grew apprehensive. Whoever he was, he clearly had military experience. The figure paused at the store's entrance, checking the perimeter, then slipped inside. Hans waited for gunfire or shouts, but everything remained quiet. Minutes later, the stranger emerged with a bag stuffed with supplies. He vanished into the darkness as quickly as he had appeared. Hans waited a bit longer to be sure the man wasn't coming back. The thought struck him that if there'd been a trap, the sniper would already be dead. But he'd made it out alive, suggesting the place might be relatively safe. Still, Hans couldn't rule out a carefully laid ambush, but hunger and thirst drove him on. He made up his mind to enter. Inside, the building greeted him with the smell of dust and old goods. The dim lights flickered but stayed steady enough to see by. Hans moved between the shelves, trying to stay silent. There was actually a decent amount of stock left. Packets of instant food and crackers. On one shelf, he saw several bottles of water. He instantly unscrewed one and cautiously sipped. It tasted normal. After a moment passed without any strange reactions, he drained half of it. He decided to save the rest, stashing it in his backpack, and grabbed a couple more bottles just in case. Suddenly he heard footsteps near the entrance. Someone had walked in. Clutching his backpack, Hans slipped behind the nearest shelf. His heart pounded, and he forced himself to stay still. From the sound of it, it was one person. The stranger moved along the shelves, rummaging among the canned goods and swearing under his breath. Hans held his own breath, praying he wouldn't be discovered. Judging by the muttered complaints about abandoned weapons and the emptiness of the area, this newcomer also had no clue what was happening in the town. Hans listened as the man found a bottle of water and started gulping it, exhaling in relief. Apparently, he had no idea there was another survivor in the store. Without warning, a deafening crash tore through the silence. The store's front window shattered, and something huge burst inside with a beastly roar. Hans, crouched behind cover, heard the other person in the store cry out, "Oh God, what is that?" before trying to fire an assault rifle. The stillness was replaced by the clatter of gunfire. Bullets whistled through the air, clanking off metal shelves, but a low growl showed that the creature was in no way frightened by the barrage. It roared again, then spoke in a low, guttural voice, repeating the exact words, "Oh God, what is that?" as though mocking the man's panic. Hans could hardly believe his ears. The beast wasn't just roaring. It could mimic human speech, like it was taunting its prey. Terror seized him. The other man was clearly just as terrified. Hans heard him whisper monster, his voice barely audible. The muzzle flash briefly lit up the creature's form. Hans saw it, massive, covered in dark fur, with long claws and fangs that could tear flesh in a single motion. Its shape was like a horrifying blend of wolf and bear, something that shouldn't exist in nature. The man's scream suddenly cut off into a wet gurgle. Hans heard a violent thud, then a sickening crunch of bones and the frantic sounds of someone trying to breathe. The creature had seized him, burying its claws in his chest. The fresh smell of blood instantly filled the space. Hans stayed where he was, realizing that trying to interfere would make him the next victim. Whatever firearm the other man had wielded hadn't saved him. Hans heard the dying man attempt to speak again, but the words were lost in his throat. Then came the sounds of bones snapping and flesh being torn apart as the monster devoured its prey, oblivious to anything else. It was truly horrifying, even though Hans could see only part of the scene from behind the shelves. A cold dread crept through him, his heart hammering in his chest. Suddenly, from the street outside came a second roar, which rose into a long howl. The beast in the store lifted its head, let out a raspy snarl, and paused its grisly feast. It seemed to be listening to the call of its kin. Hans had no idea how many of these things prowled around. It was clear that his only hope was to remain silent and still. The monster dragged the lifeless body, once a living fighter, toward the entrance, leaving a bloody trail. At the threshold, it stopped. Hans saw the creature's huge head begin to turn toward him, as if sensing a survivor. Hans froze, covering his mouth with one hand, desperate not to make a sound. For several agonizing seconds, the beast stood there with the bloody remains in its grasp, sniffing the air. Hans silently begged it to go. He thought his heart might burst from his chest. Finally, another eerie howl from outside made the monster give a short growl before it left. Its heavy footsteps faded, and the store was plunged back into suffocating silence. Hans let out a shaky breath, feeling the tremor in his hands. He knew he couldn't stay here, but also didn't want to leave supplies behind. Carefully, he made his way toward the exit, watching every step so as not to crunch broken glass. Terror still clung to him, and he couldn't shake the image of that monster tearing a man apart, echoing his last words. At the doorway, Hans spotted the dead man's weapon. Glancing down, he saw blood and scraps of clothing, but no corpse. The creature had dragged it away. Figuring the rifle might come in handy, he reached out for it. Just then, a soft crunch on the shattered glass behind him made Hans spin around, raising his own rifle. He expected to see the monster again, but instead, there stood a man in black tactical gear. He immediately lifted his hands, putting a finger to his lips in a sign to keep quiet. Hans realized the newcomer wasn't about to attack and understood that any noise could draw the beasts back. Still, he remained by the entrance with his rifle at the ready, trying to quell the tremor in his limbs. His heart still pounded from the horror he'd just witnessed, so he had no idea whether he could trust the stranger. Sensing the tension, the man lowered his hands to show he meant no harm. In a near whisper, he said, "Don't make any noise. I saw that thing storm in and drag someone out." Hans kept silent a moment longer. Looking more closely, he noticed the man seemed exhausted but not afraid. Judging by his posture and measured movements, he had obvious military training. Even so, Hans wasn't sure whether to believe him. "My name's Drake," the man continued softly, still not moving closer. "I'm not your enemy, and I don't want to fight. But there's some real horror in this town. I came to see if anyone was left in the store after that monster hauled the body off." Hans felt his guard drop a notch. He needed an ally, especially after what he'd just witnessed. Surviving here alone with unknown creatures on the prowl was madness. Still, he couldn't fully set aside his doubts about this man. Hans gave a slight nod, keeping his finger near the trigger. They moved behind the intact shelves, away from the shattered window. In hushed tones, Drake explained that he'd regained consciousness in the center of the city about 2 days prior, waking from some sort of crash he could barely remember, and finding himself in deserted streets that looked like a war zone. Hans, in turn, told him how he'd awoken at the forest's edge and stumbled upon this abandoned town. He spoke of the disorientation and pain that wouldn't leave him since the crash, how he was growing convinced that someone had set this whole situation up on purpose. Too many coincidences pointed to someone's deliberate plan. Hans's combat gear, the weapon left beside him, the store with electricity and supplies in an abandoned area, and these ferocious monsters. "I saw one of them at night," Drake said quietly. "It looked like a giant wolf, but bigger than a grizzly. I've been calling them werewolves. There's no better word for it." Hans recalled the creature that had mocked its victims' screams and shuddered. This couldn't be just some random mutant that had escaped from a laboratory. But it was too dangerous to keep talking inside the store, where fresh signs of a fight were everywhere. The flickering lights could attract anyone, armed humans or those werewolves, and it felt like anything could happen in this town. Hans suggested heading east toward the spot where he had first entered. He mentioned that he'd seen a few possible hiding places in the old buildings there. Gathering the remaining bottles of water and food packets, they divided them into 2 backpacks. Hans felt the tension, but understood that the 2 of them were now forming a team. At the door, they stopped and looked each other over once more, aware that they had to trust each other's word. The night air felt even colder than before. Staying perfectly silent was difficult. Debris crunched underfoot, and distant rustling noises echoed from somewhere. Maybe someone else was still out there searching for supplies or hiding from the werewolves. In one dark archway, they found torn clothing but no bodies, confirming that these monsters had attacked more than once. Leaving the main street, they headed east. Now and then, muffled growls came from behind walls, but they managed to avoid any direct encounters. Hans scanned every shadow, ready for anything. Drake also moved with extreme caution, relying on his combat experience. After hours of wandering, by the time the night sky began to lighten, they spotted a large building with bars on its windows. A faded sign indicated it had once been a police station. The walls looked sturdy, and the doorway could be barricaded. Hans proposed making it their temporary shelter. Drake agreed, thinking it would be a good vantage point to see who might be roaming the streets. They carefully went inside, checking every corner. Dust and cobwebs covered the old symbols on the walls. The furniture had been torn apart, documents strewn across the floor. Still, the place felt safer than being out in the open. Hans and Drake dragged some twisted desks aside, searched several corridors, and fortified the door from the inside using broken chairs and metal supports. They managed to build an improvised barricade that would at least slow down any unwanted visitors. In the main hall, they came across an old reception counter with cracked glass partitions still standing in places. Piles of trash were everywhere. Torn clothing, scraps of paper, shards of glass. It looked like the building had been attacked more than once. Drake volunteered to stand watch first, wanting to make sure no immediate threats were around. Hans finally got to lie down on an old couch they had dragged out of a back office. He didn't even remember how quickly he drifted off. Unrelenting exhaustion and all the day's events overwhelmed him. When he opened his eyes, brighter light was already filtering into the hall. Drake's hand touched Hans's shoulder gently without a sound. He whispered that so far there was no sign of danger, but staying here too long wasn't wise. Hans felt renewed energy after his brief rest and decided he should inspect the station more thoroughly to figure out exactly where they were. Hans offered to switch places. He would stand guard now, and Drake could rest. After some hesitation, Drake agreed. He picked one of the more intact offices, closed the door tight, and set his rifle within arm's reach. Meanwhile, Hans began exploring the corridors. In the first room, which looked like it used to be an interrogation area, he found broken chairs and snapped handcuffs. In another room lay scattered folders and smeared reports. Everywhere bore signs of a rampage. Hans noticed deep, parallel scratches on some walls. It looked as though a giant beast had once broken in, leaving claw marks. He figured these were from the same werewolves roaming the city. His pulse quickened, and he hurried down the hallway until he reached a heavy metal door at the far end. A rank stench of rot emanated from behind it, strong enough to permeate even through the closed door. Hans felt a wave of nausea. He pushed on the door and saw a narrow staircase leading down to a basement. The foul odor grew stronger. Switching on the small flashlight he'd found in his gear, Hans made his way down the stone steps. His eyes took a few seconds to adjust to the dimness. The stench was almost unbearable. At the bottom, he entered what looked like a small jail. Rows of barred cells on either side, one wall with bars torn clean out. Hans carefully aimed his flashlight at the floor, and a surge of horror shot through him. Human bones were scattered everywhere, along with severed arms, legs, and dark clumps of dried flesh. The ceiling was low, and the walls were spattered with old, dried blood. In one corner lay a severed head. Nearby gaped a large hole in the brickwork, apparently used by the werewolves to come and go. It looked like a predator's lair, where they stashed their kills. Hans knew he had to get out fast. Just as he turned to leave, he heard a faint moan and a barely discernible plea for help. Straining his ears, he held the flashlight out in front of him and walked along the cells. A man lay against one set of bars, missing both legs at the knee, with dried blood pooled all around him. Hans recognized him as the soldier who had entered the store first the previous night and managed to leave before Hans went in. Now the man was dying. "Help, please," the wounded man whispered, barely turning his head. He was deathly pale, his eyes darting around. Hans could see his chances were almost nil, but he had no idea what to do. Then Hans noticed two huge shapes in the corner, monsters just like the one he had seen in the store. They were so still, he hadn't even realized they were breathing. It seemed the creatures were sleeping. Most likely, they were keeping that soldier as a source of fresh meat. Hans knew that if he spoke or tried to approach, the werewolves would wake up. Then there'd be no chance of escape. He took a few steps back, keeping the flashlight trained on the sleeping beasts. The man on the floor went silent. He must have been slipping away. Hans made a snap decision. Back out quietly, find Drake, and leave the station as fast as possible. As he moved past the gap in the wall, he heard one of the creatures shift slightly. Sweat soaked his shirt. He reached the stairs, biting his lip as he climbed up, his steps all but soundless. Once in the main hall, he shut the heavy door and locked it from inside to at least slow the beasts down. Then he woke Drake, gave him a quick summary of what he'd found, and insisted they leave at once. Seeing Hans's expression, Drake knew there was no time to argue. They swiftly grabbed whatever they could carry and headed for the exit. Hans glanced down the corridor one last time, hoping the monsters hadn't heard them. The makeshift barricades at the station door would buy them a few extra seconds. They rushed out of the police station, staying low and trying not to draw attention. By now, the sun was high overhead, its brutal glare beating down on the deserted streets. It was so bright there was no shadow to hide in, but maybe that worked to their advantage. The werewolves, active at night, might be lying low in the daytime. Still, they couldn't relax. Hans and Drake ran past a row of wrecked cars when suddenly shards of asphalt flew into the air. A sharp gunshot cracked and Hans dove to the ground, ducking behind a rusted car frame. Drake dropped next to him with a grimace, clutching his right arm. The bullet had grazed him, tearing through his clothing and leaving a bloody streak. But it didn't look too deep. Hans scanned the street. Tall buildings with broken windows rose on either side of them. Somewhere above, a sniper had them in his sights. A second shot blasted through the smashed windshield of the car ahead, sending glass fragments clattering to the pavement. Hans realized the sniper was shooting to kill. He spotted a few bodies nearby, judging by their gear and clothing, likely people who had ended up here just like he and Drake. Unwilling participants in this god-forsaken city. It looked like they too had tried to escape via this road and been gunned down. Apparently the sniper wasn't interested in taking prisoners. "We have to get out of here," Hans whispered, trying not to let his voice betray his fear. "We're sitting ducks." Drake gritted his teeth, tying a piece of cloth around his wound. It wasn't bleeding much, more like a deep scratch, but the pain was clearly hindering him. He pointed toward a nearby alley, and Hans nodded. Yet the moment they even thought about moving, another bullet ricocheted off the car's hood, sending up sparks. The sniper had the upper hand. Judging by those bodies, Drake said quietly, pressed against the wheel, "This psycho doesn't let anyone out of here alive." Hans glanced around, trying to find a way out of the line of fire. The buildings were abandoned, entries blocked or collapsed, windows shattered. Out in the open, they were perfect targets. A desperate idea flickered. Maybe they could sprint to the next cover. But that seemed suicidal. The sniper knew exactly how to cover each escape route. "Or he's not alone," Hans added. "Could be a whole team of shooters stationed around the city so nobody can leave." Drake agreed. The entire place felt like a testing ground or some rigged battlefield. Once again, all the questions rose to the surface. Why these monsters? Why so many armed survivors? Who was orchestrating this? Realizing a direct escape was impossible, they decided to crawl to the nearest wreck, moving only when the sniper wasn't firing. Then, crouching low, they slipped into a narrow alleyway to get out of his line of sight. Drake grimaced with pain now and then, but kept his rifle ready. While they crept through broken bricks and fallen beams, the gunshots died down. The sniper must have lost track of them. Still, Hans had no desire to test their luck. They pushed deeper into the neighborhood where cramped streets and debris-strewn dead ends formed a labyrinth. They saw several discarded backpacks, helmets, and scattered ammo. Others had obviously been here, but no one had managed to get out. "We can't linger," Drake said, adjusting the makeshift bandage. "Snipers on one side, monsters on the other." Hans suggested they look for alternative routes, storm drains, sewers, or other underground passages. The challenge was finding such entrances, and there wasn't much time. Plus, who knew what might be lurking in those tunnels? This city seemed riddled with hidden dangers. Drake added that any loud noise could draw the werewolves. Remembering the two beasts in the station basement, Hans shuddered. He stopped to decide which way to go. The eastern road was under sniper fire. It was likely the north, south, and west were also blocked, preventing anyone from leaving. Drake theorized that whoever set up this testing ground wanted to keep everyone trapped while the monsters hunted. It made sense, but it didn't make things any easier. "Then we need to find allies," Hans concluded. "We won't survive long by ourselves with both snipers and werewolves out there." "Remember the store that still had power?" he continued. "Different people were coming by. Maybe someone else survived and went back there." Drake agreed. Trying to ride this out alone was suicide. They decided on a roundabout route, avoiding major streets and sticking to back alleys and courtyards. The sun bore down mercilessly, making them thirstier. Their plan was to reach the store closer to evening, when the sniper's effectiveness might decrease with less visibility. On the other hand, night was when the werewolves prowled. But there wasn't much choice. They walked as quickly as caution allowed, knowing another shot or an encounter with those creatures would likely be the end. Most of the buildings had shattered windows and doors yanked off their hinges or barricaded from inside. Some hallways still showed signs that people had sheltered there. Ashes from fires, makeshift beds, scattered cans. It seemed people had tried to survive among these ruins, but couldn't stay in one place for long. In other spots they found discarded rifle magazines, empty or half full, along with dried bloodstains that had baked into dark smears on the asphalt under the searing sun. These were reminders that, yes, other survivors existed, but they were either hiding or dead. After about 200 yards, they reached an old garage with a sliding door. Exhaustion was taking hold, so Hans suggested resting there to rebandage Drake's wound and regain some energy. The door was slightly open, and dim light filtered through the interior. They went in, shining their flashlight into the gloom. Rusted tools, broken crates, and an overturned cabinet lay strewn about. It looked abandoned, but not entirely for long. Someone had been there recently. Drake leaned against the wall and closed his eyes while Hans pulled out a water bottle. He soaked a piece of cloth and gently cleaned the bloody scrape on Drake's arm. It wasn't a serious wound, but without basic hygiene, infection was a real threat. And out here, even a minor illness could be deadly. They took a short break and went through their supplies. Half a bottle of water for both of them, a few crackers, and 3 packets of some questionable dry rations. Suddenly, they heard a dull thump, as if someone, or something, had bumped against the metal of the garage door. Hans froze, switched off the flashlight, and motioned for Drake to move to the far corner. They tucked themselves away as silently as possible. Hans's heart hammered, his mind racing. Was it a werewolf? Some marauder? Another scraping noise followed, then a snuffling sound like heavy animal breathing. It seemed like the creature outside was sniffing around, searching for a scent. Each second stretched painfully. Hans felt the sweat beading on his palms. If it really was a werewolf, able to detect them by smell at a distance, hiding wouldn't help. yet the creature didn't try to force its way in. It only scratched at the door, as if it vaguely suspected someone might be inside. After a few moments that felt like an eternity, the snuffling stopped. Maybe it caught another scent or heard a different noise. Whatever it was, it moved on. Hans and Drake stayed completely still for another couple of minutes before daring to move. Convinced the danger had passed, they emerged. They both understood that if a beast, or anyone else, was roaming close by, it wasn't wise to linger. Doing their best to remain quiet, they left the garage and looked around outside, relieved to see the street was empty. They continued toward the outskirts, keeping as far from main roads as possible. The sun beat down mercilessly, the air shimmering over the scorching asphalt. Ahead lay blocks with collapsed roofs, as if a hurricane had ripped through. Ceilings caved in, beams torn out. Clearly the city had suffered multiple onslaughts from these monsters. Turning a corner, they arrived at an intersection from which, about 400 yards off, they could see an old gas station. They already knew the station's fuel had long been depleted. Out of the corner of his eye, Hans noticed movement in the shadows. He fell silent and they heard muffled radio chatter. "Eastern exit is blocked. We don't see the runners. Pulling out, the beasts are close." The voices were clear, but whoever was speaking was behind a brick wall and hadn't spotted Hans and Drake. The two realized this might be a group with military communications, but they couldn't be sure of their intentions. They decided not to take the risk. Slipping away unseen seemed wiser than approaching strangers who might be allied with the snipers. Hans gestured toward a deserted alley, and they kept moving carefully, trying to stay quiet. Deep inside the block, one of the buildings had collapsed, blocking an entire street with a heap of bricks. Hans and Drake had to change direction again, relying on the mental map they had pieced together, keeping in mind the route back to the fateful little store. Along the way, they speculated that multiple squads might be operating in different parts of the city, gathering intel and lying in wait. If these people weren't tied to the organizers, maybe it would be possible to join forces. Still, caution was the rule now. By the time the sun began to set, Hans and Drake had reached the outskirts. Judging by the old billboards, this area once had cafes, motels, and small shops. Now it all looked dead. A few tattered posters clung to bent signposts. They stayed on guard, keeping their weapons close. It was undoubtedly a ghost town, yet there was still electricity and food to be found, particularly at that one store. Somewhere close by, there had to be an autonomous generator or hidden power supply. As dusk fell, their worry grew. If snipers posed the main threat by day, at night the werewolves were the real danger. Suddenly, something resembling a helicopter flew overhead. It had no visible lights and flew quite low, almost soundlessly, its presence only betrayed by the slight tremor of the air. Hans caught a glimpse of wings and a tail boom, but no further details. Within seconds, the craft vanished into the central part of the city. Drake guessed they might be delivering ammo or dropping off new players onto this battlefield. Hans imagined it could also be picking up observers, those who were watching how people survived among monsters. It was becoming clear the city might be some kind of brutal testing ground. The story of their accidents could just be the method to lure them into this trap. Realizing it was impossible to openly challenge the unknown forces at work here, Hans and Drake agreed to avoid direct confrontation for now and focus on finding allies. Alone, they couldn't take on a whole sniper unit or fight packs of werewolves. Only strength in numbers might give them a chance. Moving on, they noticed old road signs pointing to center and highway exit. But the highway exit was covered by snipers. Drake mentioned trying to see if there was a route through the hills, assuming the city wasn't fully surrounded. No one could guarantee, though, that other paths weren't blocked as well. Too many questions remained unanswered. Evening closed in, casting the city in a faint twilight. The shadows of buildings stretched out, and the streets were utterly deserted. Far off, something howled, a dog, or maybe something mutated. It was impossible to tell. Hans and Drake stayed vigilant, determined not to give themselves away. Just before the last turn toward the district that held the store, they paused. Hans listened carefully. It seemed only the wind rustled in the branches, maybe a few stray newspapers blowing across the asphalt. No gunshots, no growling. Drake signaled, "Do we move?" Hans nodded, checking his rifle. They hadn't fired a single shot all day, trying not to draw attention, but who knew what threats waited at this final stretch? Night was falling fast. By the time they came close enough to see the familiar building, it was nearly dark. Half a moon glowed overhead, lending the ruined city a sinister hue. Hans looked toward the spot where he'd first glimpsed the store's faint light, searching for the same glow. The store seemed lit, but the glow was weaker now. Perhaps something inside had malfunctioned, or someone had damaged the wiring. Slipping closer, Hans and Drake kept to the walls, using debris for cover. The dim light still shone through the grimy windows, meaning the power was still on. Outside, they saw broken window glass scattered around and dark patches of blood on the asphalt. Someone had definitely fought here after they left. They stopped a few yards away, listening for any sounds inside. They heard muted voices, as if people were whispering in the half-light. Hans tensed, recalling how werewolves could mimic human speech. But based on the tone, these voices seemed to be talking about supplies. One voice mentioned a bandaged leg. The two men decided to take a careful look. Peering through a broken section of the window, Hans saw two people in military uniforms. They looked worn out. One had a crude, blood-stained bandage on his thigh. The floor bore more signs of a recent struggle. Maybe monsters had struck, or other armed loners had passed through. Hans signaled to Drake that they should make contact. Very carefully. They had no idea how these people would react to strangers with rifles. But before Hans could call out, there was a harsh, scraping sound outside. Something heavy was moving down the alley, accompanied by raspy breathing. Drake felt a wave of dread. It might be a werewolf, drawn by the light. The people inside the store also heard it. One of them whispered, "Quiet. Be ready." Hans knew that if the beast got too close, it would smell the humans inside, and him and Drake outside. If everyone started shooting blindly, they could all end up dead. He quickly flashed a plan at Drake. Toss a distraction grenade into the opposite alley to lure the creature away. The problem was they had very few special items left, and using a grenade now meant losing a crucial resource for the future. Still, they might not have a choice. Hans carefully removed a grenade from his gear, doing his best not to jingle the metal as he eased out the pin. Drake stood by to cover him. Down at the far end of the alley, claws scraped, and a rumbling growl sounded. Hans realized they had to act at once. The beast seemed to be sniffing, trying to decide which way to go. Hans's face hardened with resolve. If they hesitated, everyone here could become prey. He refused to die without at least trying to team up with whoever was inside. Drake gave a quick nod, indicating agreement. Behind them was the faint light of the store. Ahead of them, the darkness where a monstrous threat lurked. Hans set the grenade on the ground and nudged it gently with his boot toward the alley. There was a dull thunk, followed by a blinding flash and a deafening bang. The sound echoed off the walls, rolling down the narrow street, then faded. In the distance, they heard an enraged roar and the scraping of claws. Judging by the noise, the creature rushed toward the source of the explosion. Hans and Drake knew they only had a few minutes. They sprinted to the store entrance, weapons ready. Inside, they heard movement, people alarmed by the blast. As soon as Hans stepped into the light of the doorway, guns were trained on him. "Don't shoot." "We're not enemies," Hans said quietly, trying to keep his voice calm. "There are creatures outside. Better not bring them down on us with gunfire." There were 3 people inside. One sat on the floor, clutching a bandaged leg. Another had his assault rifle aimed squarely at Hans's chest. The third hung back a bit, also injured but still ready to fight. Tension filled the air, as if one spark could start a shootout. The man who appeared to be the group's leader, judging by his hard expression, clearly didn't trust anyone. "Why are you here?" he demanded. "You want supplies? Take what you need and get out. We don't want trouble." Drake briefly explained they'd discovered a werewolf nest in the police station's basement and that snipers were covering the eastern road. He kept it short, knowing time was tight and that the noise of the grenade had likely stirred up every monster in the vicinity. The people inside listened, shifting uneasily. One of them cursed, mentioning shooters to the north who had blocked them from leaving. Hans looked at the wounded man. He had a severe bite or laceration, making it hard for him to move. Without medical help, he had little chance. It was a painful situation. Leaving him meant certain death, but trying to carry him would slow the entire group to a crawl. The leader hesitated, clearly unprepared for the sudden arrival of 2 more relatively capable fighters. "We need to form a team," Hans said, glancing at a half-empty shelf of supplies. "We can try to get around the snipers, but we'll need strength in numbers and ammo. None of us can do it alone." But the atmosphere remained tense. The others saw Hans and Drake as possible traitors. Hans and Drake, meanwhile, knew that lingering in this well-lit spot was practically inviting the werewolves in. Then the severely injured soldier groaned loudly, his condition worsening by the second. Hans and Drake exchanged looks. They had to decide. Risk their own safety to help a man who was likely beyond saving, or leave the store, letting this group handle it however they would. Time was short. Sooner or later, the monsters would show up. "We've been running looking for allies," Hans concluded. "But if you're not ready to cooperate, we're not going to sacrifice ourselves." Realizing his options were limited, the group's leader nodded. 4 of them agreed to head out together, but nobody knew what to do about the gravely injured man. Ultimately, they chose to leave him here, barricaded inside. Maybe he would last through the night, though it seemed unlikely. They talked it over briefly, making a rough plan for morning. But the werewolves could arrive at any moment, and staying under these lights was too risky. In the end, Hans and Drake resolved to go with these new allies immediately, leaving the wounded man behind. It felt cruel, but there was no other choice. They stepped out onto the street in a near-military formation, disappearing into the dim light where every footstep might bring them face to face with the horrors prowling this damned city.